For decades, African nations have been trapped in a cycle of loans, interest payments, and dependency on Western-controlled financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. From Ghana to Zambia, from Kenya to Malawi, the story has been painfully similar. Loans, debt, interest, more loans, deeper debt, loss of sovereignty. But now something historic has happened. For the first time in modern African financial history, one African nation has broken the chains: Ethiopia. Not only did Ethiopia challenge the World Bank and IMF, it forced the global lenders to erase 80% of its external debt and restructure the remaining 20% on Ethiopia's own terms. This wasn't luck. This wasn't charity. This was strategy. A carefully calculated move that has stunned the world and sent shockwaves through Washington, London, Brussels, and Beijing. To understand why what Ethiopia did is revolutionary, we need to understand the debt trap system. For decades, developing countries have been told, "Take loans for development. We will help you grow." But behind these loans were high interest rates, strict repayment deadlines, harsh economic reforms, cuts to public services, currency devaluations, privatization of national assets. This debt system did not exist to help Africa grow. It existed to ensure that African nations never fully stood up. Ethiopia was no exception. By 2020, Ethiopia owed over $28 billion to foreign lenders. The IMF wanted cuts to social spending, removal of fuel subsidies, devaluation of the Ethiopian birr, opening national markets to foreign corporations. In simple words, give us your economy or drown in debt. But Ethiopia refused. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018. Young, bold, uncompromising, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, yet not the kind of leader the West expected. He did not want Ethiopia to be dependent. He did not want Ethiopia to be controlled. He wanted self-reliance. His message was simple: a nation that cannot feed itself cannot govern itself. So instead of begging for loans, he began restructuring Ethiopia's entire national economic model. He prioritized agriculture, domestic manufacturing, energy production, GERD Dam project, regional trade partnerships, state income diversification. He was building a country that did not need the IMF to survive. When Ethiopia refused to comply with IMF adjustment conditions, the Western financial system panicked. They expected Ethiopia to fold under pressure. But Ethiopia did something unexpected. It turned toward non-Western alliances: China, Turkey, UAE, Saudi Arabia, BRICS nations. This was a political earthquake, because Ethiopia wasn't just asking for help. It was building an alternative power bloc. The World Bank realized something terrifying. If Ethiopia succeeds, other African nations would follow. The debt empire could collapse. In 2023 and 2024, Ethiopia entered debt renegotiations. But this time, Ethiopia didn't go in like a weak debtor. It went in like a sovereign power. Ethiopia told the IMF and World Bank, "You need us more than we need you. We are the gateway to East Africa. We control strategic trade routes. We are building the largest dam in Africa. You don't want us aligning fully with BRICS. So if you want influence here, erase our debt." The IMF resisted, but Ethiopia had leverage. The region needs Ethiopia for trade. The West needs Ethiopia to counter China's influence. Ethiopia's population of 120 million is a future consumer market. Ethiopia is militarily strong and geopolitically indispensable. Slowly, reality set in. Ethiopia could not be bullied. In late 2024, the IMF and major bilateral lenders agreed. 80% of Ethiopia's external debt would be forgiven. The remaining 20% spread over decades at near zero interest. This was not a negotiation. This changes everything, because Ethiopia just proved debt is not destiny. Sovereignty is a choice, and financial slavery can be broken. Other African nations are watching: Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana, Zambia. If they follow Ethiopia, the global financial architecture will collapse. This is why Western media is silent. This is why analysts are nervous. This is why economists are shocked. Because Ethiopia didn't just erase debt, it rewrote the rules of global economics. This moment is more than financial. It is historical. From colonialism to coup-backed dictators to IMF debt slavery, Africa has been suppressed for 500 years. But now, Africa is awakening. Strong leaders are rising: Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore; Mali, Assimi Goïta; Abdurrahman Chiani; Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed. These leaders do not fear the West. They do not beg for loans. They do not apologize for independence. They represent a new Africa, confident, united, unbroken. The world is changing. The empire is crumbling. A new chapter has begun. Ethiopia just showed the world. Africa is done asking. Africa is now deciding. And once Africa stands, the world will never be the same again. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. Global power is not built overnight. Countries negotiate from strength. Strength does not come from speeches or flags. Strength comes from resources, population, geography, and national unity. Ethiopia knew this. So silently, over years, Ethiopia built the foundations of sovereignty. 1. Population power. Ethiopia is the second most populous nation in Africa. More than 120 million people, a young population, a working population, a nation that can produce, build, farm, manufacture, innovate. In geopolitics, population is power. While Western nations are aging and shrinking, Africa is growing and getting younger. This means one thing: the future workforce of the world is African. The future innovation is African. The future markets are African. Ethiopia understood that global powers would need access to Africa, and Ethiopia positioned itself to be the gateway. Ethiopia controls one of the most strategic regions in the world, the Horn of Africa. This region is the access point to the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, Middle Eastern trade routes, East African economy. The world's oil, food, and manufactured goods pass through nearby waters. If Ethiopia shifts alliances, trade routes shift. Political influence shifts. Military strategy shifts. This gave Ethiopia geostrategic leverage no Western lender could ignore. The GERD project. Then came the masterpiece, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD, the largest dam in Africa, one of the biggest hydroelectric projects on Earth. Not funded by the IMF, not funded by the World Bank, funded by Ethiopian citizens. Taxi drivers donated, farmers donated. Farmers donated, teachers donated, Ethiopian diaspora donated. A nation built its own power supply with its own money. GERD will produce 6,000 plus megawatts of energy. This means Ethiopia will power its industries. Ethiopia will electrify its farms. Ethiopia will export electricity to neighboring nations. Electricity is modern civilization. He who controls energy controls destiny. This was not just a dam. This was a declaration. We do not need your loans to grow. To escape IMF dependency, Ethiopia didn't only build infrastructure. It redesigned its entire economic system. Agriculture modernization. Ethiopia is one of the oldest agricultural civilizations on Earth. Yet for decades, colonial trade models kept Africa, exporting raw goods, importing finished goods, meaning Africa earned little and paid much. Ethiopia broke this system. Instead of exporting raw coffee beans, Ethiopia invested in coffee processing plants. Instead of exporting raw sesame, Ethiopia moved to packaging and branding. This shift turned raw resources into profit. This is how you escape poverty. You stop being the raw material provider and become the product manufacturer. Domestic manufacturing industrial parks were built across Ethiopia. Textile factories, leather goods factories, automotive assembly plants, pharmaceutical plants. Foreign corporations moved production to Ethiopia because labor is productive, energy is becoming cheaper, government supports industrial growth, jobs increased, exports increased, national income increased, loans became less necessary. This was Ethiopia's real weapon, economic independence. The global South has started rejecting dependence on the US dollar. This is called de-dollarization. Ethiopia joined currency agreements with China, Turkey, UAE, Saudi Arabia. This allowed trade in local currencies, meaning Ethiopia could import without needing US dollars. This is one of the primary tools the IMF uses to control nations, the dollar dependency trap. Once Ethiopia reduced its dollar reliance, IMF pressure weakened. The chains were breaking. Farmers donated. Teachers donated. Ethiopian diaspora donated. A nation built its own power supply with its own money. GERD will produce 6,000 plus megawatts of energy. This means Ethiopia will power its industries. Ethiopia will electrify its farms. Ethiopia will export electricity to neighboring nations. Electricity is modern civilization. He who controls energy controls destiny. This was not just a dam. This was a declaration. We do not need your loans to grow. To escape IMF dependency, Ethiopia didn't only build infrastructure. It redesigned its entire economic system. Agriculture modernization. Ethiopia is one of the oldest agricultural civilizations on Earth. Yet for decades, colonial trade models kept Africa, exporting raw goods, importing finished goods, meaning Africa earned little and paid much. Ethiopia broke this system. The rise of BRICS changed everything. BRICS originally, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now expanding to include Ethiopia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE. This group represents half of the world's population, massive natural resources, huge industrial production, strong military coalitions, global trade influence. BRICS is building a global payment system outside SWIFT, a development bank outside IMF, a currency independent of the dollar. Ethiopia joining BRICS was a global earthquake. The West realized, if Ethiopia leaves the IMF system completely, others will too. Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda. The domino effect had already begun. When European banks collapse, Western media screams. When Ethiopia breaks free, Western media goes silent. Why? Because the narrative has always been, Africa cannot prosper without Western guidance. If Ethiopia proves Africa can succeed independently, the entire global propaganda structure falls. This is why Ethiopia's success is not shown on TV. This is why Western news outlets downplay the debt cancellation. This is why analysts pretend it is temporary relief. They fear the truth. Africa does not need saviors. Africa needs sovereignty. No revolution is smooth. No independence is free. Ethiopia faced internal conflict, ethnic divisions, foreign-funded destabilization, propaganda campaigns, sanctions, pressure. The goal was simple: break Ethiopia from within so it remains weak and dependent. Yet Ethiopia survived because citizens refused to accept foreign control. The government maintained unity. Regional powers provided diplomatic support. A nation survives not because it has no enemies, but because it has self-respect. Ethiopia's victory is symbolic. It is psychological liberation. It tells African nations, you are not poor. You were made to feel poor. You are rich in gold, lithium, diamonds, oil, gas, land, water, people, culture, history, identity. Africa is not lacking resources. Africa is lacking control of its resources. Ethiopia just proved control is possible, freedom is possible, sovereignty is possible. This is why leaders like Ibrahim Traore call for national resource control, end of Western military presence, Pan-African unity. The spirit of independence is rising again. When the news of Ethiopia's debt relief shook the world, reactions began from every direction. In Western financial circles, analysts sat in quiet concern. They understood the message hidden behind those numbers. This was not just about Ethiopia saving billions. This was about a nation rejecting the economic model that had controlled Africa for decades. Financial institutions rely on interest. Debt is their power. Control is not enforced by armies alone. Control is enforced by loans, currency valuation, and dependency. If one country breaks free, others start asking questions. If many break free, the global system changes. Meanwhile, African citizens across the continent celebrated. They shared Ethiopia's story on social media. They discussed it in cafes, schools, buses, and market stalls. A sense of collective awakening began to form. For years, Africans were told that freedom is complicated, that economic liberation is unrealistic, that independence is impo. There is a new identity rising in Africa. It is strong, self-assured, and unafraid of global judgment. This identity is built on cultural pride, economic confidence, political awareness, historical understanding. Africa is no longer looking outward for approval. Africa is looking inward for power. Young Africans are reading history previously hidden. They are learning how colonial economies were designed to extract wealth. They are realizing that their countries were wealthy long before foreign influence arrived. This new awareness is not aggressive. It is clear and calm. It does not ask for permission. It simply recognizes value. Ethiopia stands as an example of what happens when a nation refuses to accept a narrative of weakness. Chapter 17, The Test of Time. The future will not be easy. Even with debt relief, growth requires discipline, unity, and strategic focus. Ethiopia is now restructuring its economy, strengthening regional diplomacy, expanding manufacturing, increasing agricultural exports, building energy and transport networks, forming African alliances. This is not just survival. This is a new African renaissance, a rebirth, a reawakening, a rediscovery of identity. Ethiopia stands at the center of this rise, not as a follower, not as a victim, as a leader. Final message. History is changing. For centuries, Africa was told, you cannot do it. Now Africa responds, Watch us. Ethiopia did not just erase debt.
Onun kıtası.
Ethiopia wrote a new
Selam.
future. A
Dur.
future where Africa stands tall. Unapologetic, unbroken, unstoppable. This is the moment the world will remember. The day Africa said, enough. The day Ethiopia showed the way.